The encounter. The morning sun streamed through the greasy windows of Clarkson's diner, painting faint streaks of gold on the cracked vinyl seats. The smell of bacon, eggs, and burnt coffee mingled in the air, the kind of scent that clung to your clothes long after you left. The hum of the ceiling fans, the clink of utensils, and the chatter of regulars made up the soundtrack of Maya Williams' mornings. Maya, 29, stood at the edge of booth 6, coffee pot in hand. She had learned to balance three things at once: service with a smile, defense against the world's unkindness, and the stubborn flicker of hope that maybe life wouldn't always be this hard. This morning, however, wasn't shaping up to be routine. At booth 6 sat two young boys, maybe 7 or 8, with mischievous grins that whispered trouble before their mouths even opened. Across from them in the corner seat was a girl, fragile, small, her eyes wide behind round glasses. She was no more than 10. Her hands trembled as she tried to lift a straw to her lips, her body moving with the uneven rhythm of someone fighting against her own muscles. The boys started to snicker. At first it was quiet, under-the-breath giggles. Then came the exaggerated mimicking, their voices contorting cruelly to mock the girl's stammer as she tried to order a glass of milk. Maya's chest tightened. She recognized the tone, the sharp, careless cruelty of children who hadn't yet been taught compassion, whose parents often enabled them instead of correcting them. The little girl's lower lip quivered. Her cheeks flushed red. She dropped the menu, her small fingers clawing at her lap as if wishing she could disappear. Maya's hand gripped the coffee pot tighter. She told herself, stay calm, stay professional, but her gut burned. She had been here before, on the receiving end of laughter that cut deeper than words, of sneers that reminded her she was less than in someone else's eyes. The taller boy, Brady, leaned forward and whispered something cruel, then laughed so hard he slapped the table. The girl shrank further into the corner. That was it. Maya stepped forward. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of weight that made people listen. Don't mess with her again, boys. The words landed like a stone thrown into a still pond. The diner fell silent. Conversation stuttered to a halt. Forks paused in midair. Brady blinked, startled. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. His lip trembled, and he let out a loud, exaggerated sob. She yelled at me! Heads turned. A woman at the next booth, a tall, blonde woman in a beige pantsuit, her hair curled into perfection, her lips painted sharp red, snapped her head around. Her name was Karen Doyle, though no one in the diner knew that yet. What they did know, from the way she stood, heels clicking against the floor like a judge descending to deliver a verdict, was that this was someone who thought rules didn't apply to her. What the hell did you just say to my son? Karen barked, eyes blazing as she towered over Maya. Maya didn't flinch. She set the coffee pot down carefully on the counter behind her, wiped her hands on her apron, and faced the woman squarely. I told him to stop mocking that little girl, Maya said, voice steady. He was laughing at her voice. That's not teasing. That's cruelty. Karen's nostrils flared. Her eyes narrowed. Who the hell do you think you are talking to my child like that? I'm someone who works here, Maya replied, her fingers brushing her name tag. And someone who won't stand by while a child with special needs is humiliated in front of a room full of adults too afraid to say anything. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Karen let out a laugh, cold and sharp. You're a waitress, she sneered, dragging out the word as if it were dirt on her tongue. Not a teacher, not a therapist, not the morality police. You're here to pour coffee, not lecture my child on ethics. Something inside Maya cracked, but it wasn't anger. It was resolve. I'm here to serve people, she said softly, not cowards. The gasp that followed was audible. Karen's face twisted, fury flashing in her eyes. In one swift motion, she grabbed her glass of iced tea and hurled it across the narrow aisle. The heavy glass struck Maya square in the forehead. The shattering sound rang through the diner like a gunshot. Liquid and shards cascaded across the floor. Maya staggered but didn't fall. She touched her forehead, blinked at the blood that stained her fingers, and straightened her shoulders. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there, silent and unbroken. The diner went still. A hush fell so heavy it felt like gravity itself had grown stronger. Then came the whispers. Did you see that? She hit her, call the police, and then a new voice cut through the murmurs. Deep, firm, carrying authority that made even Karen falter. That's enough. The voice came from the back of the diner. All heads turned. At table 12 by the window sat a man whose presence was both commanding and understated. His suit was tailored but not flashy, his watch sleek but unbranded. His face, clean-shaven with lines of age and wisdom, was recognizable, though most had only ever seen it on magazine covers or financial news reports. Alexander Cole, billionaire, investor, philanthropist, a man whose empire stretched across industries, whose decisions could shift markets. And sitting beside him, clutching a small stuffed rabbit with one trembling hand, was his daughter Lila, the girl who had been mocked. Maya's breath caught. Alexander rose to his feet. His height, his calmness, his sheer presence drew silence thicker than any command could. He placed one hand gently on Lila's shoulder before stepping toward the chaos at booth 6. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but Alexander's eyes cut to hers with a force that rendered her mute. "You should be ashamed," he said, voice low but sharp. "Your son was mocking my daughter, and you rewarded his cruelty with more cruelty." Karen's bravado faltered. She, Alexander raised a hand. "Don't, you've already said enough." He turned to Maya, his gaze softening as he took in the cut on her forehead, the blood streaking her cheek, and the quiet dignity with which she stood. "You defended her," he said, "when no one else did?" Maya swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the stares drilling into her from every corner of the diner. "It was the right thing to do," she murmured. Alexander's lips pressed into a line that could have been pride or sorrow. "The right thing," he repeated as if tasting the words. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp handkerchief. With careful precision, he offered it to Maya. She hesitated, then accepted, pressing it lightly to her wound. Around them, the diner buzzed with whispers. Phones were pulled out. Photos snapped. The story was already spreading beyond the greasy walls of Clarkson's. But in that moment, Maya didn't care. She wasn't thinking about headlines or viral videos. She was thinking only of the little girl clutching her stuffed rabbit, whose wide eyes now glistened with something more than fear. Hope. For the first time since she had sat down, Lila smiled. Ripples of courage. The diner never felt the same again after that morning. For Maya, it was as if the air had changed, carrying with it the heavy scent of whispers and lingering eyes. She had always been used to being noticed, sometimes admired for her grace under pressure, more often ignored as just another nameless waitress in an apron. But now every glance seemed to hold something different. Pity, admiration, curiosity, fear, and beneath it all a current of speculation. The moment Karen Doyle's glass had shattered against her forehead, Maya's quiet anonymity had cracked with it, and she wasn't sure if it would ever piece back together again. The very next day, Clarkson's was busier than it had ever been. It wasn't because people had suddenly discovered a newfound love for greasy eggs or burnt coffee, but because word had spread. People wanted to sit at the booth where it happened. They wanted to catch a glimpse of the waitress who stood up to that woman. Some wanted selfies. Others wanted to whisper their support. A few came only to stare at her as if she were some kind of sideshow act, part hero and part curiosity. Maya, for her part, kept her head down and worked as she always had. She poured coffee. She served pancakes. She smiled politely even when her head still throbbed from the gash above her brow, now sealed with 2 neat stitches from the ER. Yet even as the diner hummed with gossip, Maya's inner world was quiet, contemplative, and heavy. She hadn't done it for attention. She hadn't done it to become a story. She had spoken up because silence had always been her enemy. Silence had let her younger self suffer when the world mocked her, when her own father walked out, when her mother worked herself into exhaustion, and no one stepped in to help. She knew too well what it meant to be unseen and undefended. That little girl, Lila, had deserved better, so she had acted. And now here she was at the center of a storm she never asked for. What Maya didn't yet know was that her actions had struck deeper than the gossip swirling through the town. They had struck the heart of Alexander Cole himself. Alexander had spent his life commanding rooms filled with power brokers, politicians, and investors who measured worth in net gains and losses. He was used to the flattery of men who wanted his approval, the cautious admiration of women who wanted his wealth, and the constant calculation of colleagues who treated him like a walking vault. Rarely did he encounter someone who spoke from the marrow of truth without fear of consequence. But when he had watched Maya that morning, standing tall with blood trickling down her temple, refusing to bow to cruelty, something inside him had shifted. For years, he had built walls around himself and especially around his daughter. Lila's condition, fragile and misunderstood by most, had made her the subject of whispers at every gathering. Even within elite circles, people weren't kind. The pity, the judgment, the quiet cruelty disguised as sympathy, it all burned him. He had vowed to shield her from it, to keep her safe behind guarded doors and polished security. Yet here, in a small-town diner, a stranger had defended Lila not because of who she was related to, not because of any cameras or accolades, but simply because it was right. That kind of courage was rare, priceless even. In the days that followed, Alexander sent his assistant back to Clarkson's more than once. At first, it was to check in discreetly on Maya, whether she was all right, whether she had faced retaliation. Then it became something more. He began to ask questions. Who was she? What was her story? Did she have family? Did she need help? The assistant reported back with only fragments. Maya was a hard worker, known for her kindness, sometimes called too fierce for her own good. She lived in a modest apartment alone. She had dropped out of college after her mother passed away. She worked double shifts because the bills never stopped coming. The more Alexander learned, the more intrigued he became. He could understand business empires and boardroom negotiations, but he struggled to understand someone who had so little yet gave so much. There was no calculation in her actions, no advantage to be gained, just unshakable integrity. Meanwhile, Maya began to feel the other side of fame's shadow. For every person who came into the diner to thank her, another came in to sneer. She received phone calls, some anonymous, some hateful, some accusing her of overstepping. Karen Doyle's social circle, wealthy and influential, began whispering poison into the community. That waitress doesn't know her place. She embarrassed a child. She just wanted attention. The words spread like smoke, thin and choking. Maya tried to ignore it, but she felt the weight pressing down. Bills piled on her kitchen counter. Her landlord left yet another notice about the rising rent. Her car sputtered each morning like an old man refusing to wake. She told herself to keep pushing, to keep showing up. But some nights, when she sat alone at her small kitchen table with nothing but a flickering bulb above her, she wondered if courage was worth the cost. And then, one evening, as the sun melted into shades of copper and crimson, Alexander himself walked into the diner. The room froze as if the air had been sucked out. He wasn't the kind of man who could blend into the background, not with his tailored suit and the aura of command that clung to him. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who never had to second-guess his presence in any space. People whispered his name like a prayer and a secret all at once. Maya looked up from where she was wiping a table, her rag pausing mid-stroke. Her heart skipped. Not because he was a billionaire, but because she had never expected to see him again. Not like this. Alexander walked straight to her, ignoring the stares, ignoring the phones that discreetly lifted to capture the moment. He stopped just before her, his gaze steady, his voice calm but carrying a resonance that silenced even the hum of the fans above. "I owe you thanks," he said simply. Maya blinked, caught off guard. For what? For defending my daughter when no one else did. Her hand tightened around the rag. "You don't owe me anything. I just did what anyone should have done." "But they didn't," Alexander replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's what makes you different." The words hung between them, heavy and electric. For a moment, Maya felt stripped bare under his gaze, as if he could see not just the waitress in front of him, but the woman who had fought battles alone, who had stitched herself back together after every disappointment. Before she could answer, Lila peeked out from behind her father's side. She clutched her rabbit tightly, her glasses slipping down her nose. Her voice was soft, hesitant, but steady. "Hi," she said, her smile small but genuine. Maya's heart warmed. She crouched slightly so she was at Lila's eye level. "Hi, sweetheart. How are you feeling today?" Lila's eyes brightened. "Better. Because of you." Maya bit the inside of her cheek, holding back the sudden rush of emotion. "You're braver than you think, you know that?" The little girl nodded solemnly, as if receiving a truth she could carry forever. Alexander watched the exchange, and something stirred within him. a realization that his daughter had found in Maya a comfort that wealth and privilege could never buy. He made a decision then, one that surprised even himself. "Would you join us for dinner?" he asked. Maya blinked again, startled. "Dinner?" "Yes, with me and Lila, not here," he added, glancing around at the diner filled with prying eyes. "Somewhere private. I'd like to hear your story." For a moment, Maya hesitated. The thought of stepping into his world, into a space so far removed from her own, sent a rush of nerves through her veins. But then she saw Lila's hopeful eyes and realized this wasn't just about Alexander's curiosity. It was about the bond forming between a waitress who refused to be silent and a little girl who needed to believe in kindness. Maya nodded slowly. "All right." And just like that, the ripples of courage grew wider, reaching beyond the walls of the diner, beyond the confines of one act of bravery. The paths of two very different worlds had... The invitation. The evening of the dinner approached with a weight Maya could not shake, no matter how many times she tried to talk herself into calm. She had never been invited anywhere by a man of Alexander Cole's stature, let alone to dinner at his request. For 2 nights after his visit to the diner, she had replayed the moment over and over in her mind. The steadiness in his voice, the unflinching way he had looked at her, and the way Lila's small face had lit up when Maya had spoken to her. There had been no pretense, no polished performance in that little girl's eyes. There had only been gratitude, fragile and raw, as if Maya had offered her something no one else had dared. That was the thought that steadied her nerves whenever the panic threatened to take over. She wasn't doing this to impress a billionaire. She was doing it because a little girl needed to see that kindness could stretch beyond a single moment. Still, standing in front of her mirror that Friday evening, Maya felt like an imposter in her own skin. Her best dress was a simple navy blue piece she had bought 2 years ago for a cousin's wedding. It was plain, sleeveless, and just modest enough that she hoped it could pass as tasteful in circles far above her own. She had polished her shoes 3 times, curled her hair until the ends flipped just right, and debated for too long over whether to wear lipstick. In the end, she decided against it. She wanted to look like herself, not like someone she was pretending to be. The car arrived precisely at 7. Not a taxi, not an Uber. An elegant black town car with a driver in a crisp suit who greeted her with a warm, professional smile. "Ms. William?" he asked, holding the door open with a kind of deference she was unaccustomed to. Maya's instinct was to laugh, to correct him with a, "Just Maya, please." But the way he said it reminded her that tonight was not about comfort zones. It was about stepping into a world she had never been invited to before. The drive itself was surreal. The city lights blurred past as the car wound its way through neighborhoods she rarely saw, each more extravagant than the last. Towering gates opened silently, revealing sprawling lawns and homes that looked like something from glossy magazines. By the time they pulled up to Alexander's estate, Maya's breath had caught in her throat. It wasn't ostentatious, not in the gaudy sense, but it radiated power and quiet wealth. The mansion stood tall, bathed in golden light, its architecture a blend of modern elegance and timeless grandeur. She stepped out of the car, clutching her small handbag like a lifeline, and for the first time that evening she wondered if she had made a mistake. But then the door opened, and there was Lila. She stood just inside the entrance hall, her rabbit tucked under one arm, wearing a soft pink dress that looked as though it had been chosen with care to make her feel special. Her face lit up the moment she saw Maya. "You came," she exclaimed, her voice carrying the kind of unfiltered joy that cut straight through the walls of doubt Maya had built around herself. Maya smiled, all nerves melting away as she knelt to greet her. "Of course I came. I couldn't say no to your invitation, could I?" Lila giggled, hiding her face behind the rabbit before tugging at Maya's hand. "Come on, Daddy's waiting." The mansion's interior was just as breathtaking as its exterior. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, walls lined with art that looked too priceless to be real, and the faint scent of roses and cedarwood lingered in the air. Yet despite its grandeur, the space felt lived in. Bookshelves were filled with dog-eared novels. Photographs lined the hallway, snapshots of Alexander with Lila at various stages of her childhood, moments of laughter and tenderness that softened the man's otherwise imposing image. Alexander emerged from the dining room, dressed not in a suit this time, but in a simple charcoal sweater and slacks. He looked for the first time less like the untouchable billionaire the world revered, and more like a father hosting a quiet evening at home. "Maya," he greeted warmly, his voice carrying that same resonance that had silenced a diner full of people. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for inviting me," Maya replied, her tone polite but guarded. She wasn't sure yet what he wanted from her, whether this was a test, a transaction, or something else entirely. Dinner was set in a smaller dining room than she had expected. The table was modest compared to the size of the mansion, set for 3 with polished silverware and delicate china. The meal itself was elegant but not ostentatious: roast chicken, seasonal vegetables, and fresh bread that filled the room with a comforting aroma. Maya felt her shoulders ease slightly. This wasn't a banquet meant to intimidate. It was a family dinner, simple in its intention. Conversation began cautiously. Alexander asked about her life, her work, her mother. Maya answered as honestly as she could without unraveling too much of herself. She told him about dropping out of college to care for her mother, about working 2 jobs to make ends meet, about how she had ended up at Clarkson's. He listened intently, his gaze never wandering, his questions thoughtful rather than prying. At one point, Lila leaned forward, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Maya, do you ever get scared?" The question caught her off guard. She glanced at Alexander, who looked equally surprised, before turning back to the little girl. "All the time," she admitted softly. "But I've learned that being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you do what's right even when you are." Lila smiled, as though Maya had handed her a secret key. "That's what you did at the diner, isn't it?" Maya's throat tightened. "Yes, sweetheart. That's what I did." The moment stretched, tender and profound, as Alexander watched the exchange with something unreadable in his eyes. For years he had tried to teach his daughter strength through protection, by shielding her from the world's cruelty. Yet here was Maya, teaching her that strength was found not in hiding but in standing tall, even when it hurt. After dinner, Alexander invited Maya to the library for coffee while Lila settled in with a bedtime story. The library was a cavernous room filled with shelves that reached the ceiling, a crackling fire warming the space. Alexander poured 2 cups himself, setting one before her as they sat across from each other. "I need to be honest," he began, his voice steady. "I didn't invite you here just to say thank you. I wanted to understand you, to know why you did what you did." Maya leaned back, meeting his gaze. "I already told you. It was the right thing to do." "Plenty of people know what's right," he countered. "Few act on it. You risked your job, your safety, your reputation. That's not nothing." She considered his words carefully, then said, "When you've been on the receiving end of silence, you learn fast that speaking up is the only way to survive. I wasn't going to let that little girl feel alone, not when I knew exactly how it felt." For the first time that evening, Alexander's composure cracked. His eyes softened, his shoulders lowered, and he let out a breath that sounded heavier than it should have. "You may not realize it, but what you did that day changed something. For her. And for me." The admission hung between them, weighty and vulnerable. Maya didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, sipping her coffee as the firelight flickered against the walls. It was in that moment that she realized this evening was not about wealth, or power, or obligation. It was about connection. The kind that transcended worlds. The kind that could bridge the gap between a billionaire and a waitress, between privilege and hardship, between protection and courage. And though neither of them knew what lay ahead, one thing was certain. The invitation had opened a door neither of them would be able to close again. The storm, the quiet after Maya's dinner with Alexander and Lila, did not last long. For a brief moment, she allowed herself the luxury of peace, of replaying the sound of Lila's laughter echoing through the mansion halls, of remembering the warmth in Alexander's eyes as he confessed that her bravery had changed something in him. It was rare for her life to feel anything but a grind, and that evening had felt like stepping into a different universe. She carried it with her the next morning at the diner, smiling more easily as she poured coffee, her heart lighter than it had been in months. But storms rarely announced themselves politely, and this one began with whispers. Karen Doyle had not forgotten the humiliation she suffered in Clarkson's. The woman had been raised in wealth and entitlement, accustomed to having her word treated as law, to be contradicted publicly, to be scolded by a waitress of all people, and worst of all, to have her violence witnessed by a billionaire whose influence dwarfed her own. That was a wound she could not leave to scab. She nursed her resentment like a fire, fanning it into a blaze until revenge felt not only satisfying but necessary. At first, it came in subtle ways. Customers began leaving smaller tips at Maya's tables. Some regulars who had always greeted her warmly now avoided her eyes. A rumor spread that she had staged the entire incident for attention, that she had provoked Karen's son intentionally, hoping to catch the eye of Alexander Cole. Another rumor claimed she had already begun courting him, using his daughter as a pawn to elevate herself. Each story twisted the truth until Maya became less a heroine and more a caricature of ambition. She ignored it as best she could, holding her head high even as the stares followed her through town. Yet when she came home one night to find a crude message scrawled on her apartment door, "Gold digger. Fraud. Stay away from him," her hands trembled as she scrubbed the paint away. She had fought battles before, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a child who had found courage in her, about a man who had let down his walls because of her, and the world outside seemed determined to poison that fragile connection. Alexander noticed the shift almost immediately. He had grown up in a world where whispers carried as much weight as facts, where reputations could be dismantled in private salons before the truth ever reached daylight. He recognized the tactics, the venom hidden in polished words. He had expected Karen Doyle to retaliate, but even he underestimated the breadth of her influence. Within weeks, Maya's name began appearing in gossip columns, painted as a schemer who had captured the sympathy of a wealthy man through theatrics. Anonymous bloggers dissected her background, mocking her education, her apartment, even her mother's death. It enraged him in a way few things did. He had been the target of media storms before, but he had the armor of wealth and power to shield himself. Maya had no such armor, and yet she bore the attacks with the same quiet dignity she had shown in the diner. She continued working shifts, continued paying her bills, continued living her life as though the world hadn't turned her into its latest spectacle. One evening, when she came to the mansion for dinner, Alexander confronted her gently about it. They sat in the library again, firelight flickering against the shelves, the quiet hum of the city beyond the windows. "You don't have to pretend it isn't affecting you," he said, his voice low. "I see what they're saying. I know the damage it can do." Maya set her coffee cup down carefully, her fingers lingering on the porcelain rim. "What would you have me do, Alexander Hyde? Apologize for standing up for your daughter? That's what they want. For me to disappear so they can keep their tidy little world unshaken." His jaw tightened, admiration flickering behind his frustration. "You shouldn't have to fight this alone." "I've been fighting alone my whole life," she replied, her tone steady but edged with weariness. "This isn't new. It's just louder." That night after she left, Alexander sat awake in his study long after Lila had gone to bed. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his wealth not as a privilege but as a prison. He could buy silence, he could command respect, but he couldn't purchase the kind of courage Maya carried. He wondered if protecting her meant stepping into the storm beside her, even if it meant exposing his own vulnerabilities. The storm reached its peak 2 weeks later. Clarkson's diner was packed that Saturday morning, the booths filled with locals and curious visitors hoping to catch a glimpse of the waitress. Maya moved through the crowd with practiced grace, balancing trays and refilling mugs when the door slammed open and Karen Doyle herself strode in. The diner seemed to inhale collectively. Karen's heels struck the floor like gunfire as she marched to the counter, her eyes locking on Maya with venom. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You think you can humiliate me, latch onto him, and parade yourself as some saint? Let me tell you something, women like you are a dime a dozen, and men like him don't keep women like you." The words sliced through the air, each one a dagger meant to shred whatever dignity Maya still clung to. She felt the stares, the judgment, the hunger for spectacle. For a moment, her throat tightened. Her hands trembled. But then she remembered Lila's smile, remembered Alexander's confession, remembered the silence she had vowed never to feed again. She stepped out from behind the counter, standing tall despite the pounding of her heart. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Men like him don't keep women like me. But not because I'm not worth it. Because I don't need to be kept." The room erupted in murmurs, some shocked, some approving. Karen's face twisted, but before she could hurl another insult, a new voice cut through the noise. Enough. The word came from the doorway, firm and commanding. Alexander stood there, his presence filling the diner as it had that first day. Lila was at his side, clutching her rabbit, her gaze fixed on Maya with unwavering trust. Alexander stepped forward, his eyes cold as steel when they landed on Karen. You've embarrassed yourself enough. Leave now. Karen sputtered, her arrogance faltering under the weight of his authority. For once, her power meant nothing. She turned on her heel, storming out as the diner buzzed with the electricity of what had just transpired. Alexander turned to Maya, his gaze softening. In that moment, surrounded by witnesses and whispers, it became clear that the storm had not broken them apart. It had bound them closer together. Yet as Maya met his eyes, she understood something he hadn't said aloud. This was only the beginning. The storm was far from over, and the choices they made next would determine whether it destroyed them or transformed them. The test of fire. The days following the showdown in Clarkson's diner unfolded with a tension that hung heavy in the air, like the charged stillness before a thunderstorm. Maya returned to her routines, but nothing about them felt routine anymore. She still rose before dawn, tied her apron and walked the familiar path to work, but her life was no longer her own. Every move she made seemed to be watched, discussed, dissected. Some people treated her like a folk hero, stopping her mid-shift to thank her for her courage. Others glared with thinly veiled hostility, muttering words like attention seeker and troublemaker as they passed. She had grown a thick skin over the years, but now even she felt the sting. Alexander, meanwhile, discovered that wealth and influence, the shields he had relied upon for decades, were powerless against the kind of warfare that attacked character rather than assets. Karen Doyle and her circle had begun to whisper more strategically, feeding stories to columnists and leveraging connections in social clubs and charity boards. Suddenly, headlines weren't just about a diner altercation. They were about Alexander Cole, widower and billionaire, falling prey to a waitress with a tragic backstory. Photographs of Maya began appearing online, blurry shots of her leaving work, walking to her car, entering her apartment. The commentary was vicious, each caption dripping with insinuation about her motives. The true blow came when one of Alexander's business competitors seized the moment. Roland Pierce, a ruthless mogul who had clashed with Alexander for years, sensed opportunity. At a press conference for his latest venture, Roland made a seemingly offhand remark that was anything but casual. "It's a shame," he said to reporters, his smile razor-sharp. "A man with so much influence, so much to offer society, distracted by, let's call it a personal entanglement. One wonders how it might affect his judgment on matters that impact thousands of jobs and billions of dollars." The remark spread like wildfire. Investors whispered. Stock analysts speculated. Within a week, Alexander's flagship company saw its share prices dip, not because of numbers or performance, but because of perception. Maya felt the shift before Alexander ever mentioned it. When she arrived at his home one evening, she noticed the subtle changes. The assistants moving more briskly, the security detail scanning the perimeter with sharper eyes, the way Alexander's jaw clenched a little tighter than usual. He tried to shield her from it, to keep his tone light as Lila rushed to greet her. But Maya had always been perceptive. She saw the fatigue in his eyes, the weight pressing down on his shoulders. That night, after Lila had gone to bed, they sat again in the library, the fire crackling softly between them. Alexander set his glass of brandy on the table and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "They're coming after me," he admitted, his voice low. "Not directly, not with anything tangible, but with shadows, with rumors, and it's working." Maya folded her hands in her lap, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his tone. "Because of me." His eyes snapped up to hers, sharp and certain. "No, because of them. Because they see something they can't control. You're not the problem, Maya. You're the truth they're trying to bury." The word stirred something deep within her, yet she couldn't ignore the guilt that gnawed at her. "Still, I don't want to be the reason your world falls apart." Alexander shook his head. "My world doesn't fall apart because of you. It falls apart if I allow them to dictate what's right, if I let them convince me that decency is weakness." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the firelight casting shifting shadows across the room. Then Maya spoke softly, almost to herself. "It's one thing to stand up to cruelty in a diner. It's another to stand up to it when the whole world is watching. And that, Alexander replied, is exactly why we must. The true test came days later, when Maya herself was dragged into the storm more directly. A lawsuit appeared, filed in Karen Doyle's name but funded and orchestrated by forces far more powerful. The claim accused Maya of assaulting Karen's child during the diner incident, painting her as volatile, dangerous, and unfit to work in a public setting. It was a grotesque twisting of the truth, but it gained traction in tabloids eager for scandal. Overnight, Maya went from the courageous waitress to the woman accused of striking a child. The diner's owner, terrified of the publicity, suspended her until the matter could be resolved. Just like that, her livelihood was stripped away. Bills that already strained her thin wallet became suffocating weights. Landlords, banks, and utility companies didn't pause for justice. They demanded their due. For the first time since it all began, Maya wept. Alone in her small apartment with eviction notices piling and her refrigerator half empty, she let the tears come. Not because she regretted what she had done, but because the cost was finally too heavy to ignore. Her courage had protected a child, but it had also left her exposed to a world that seemed determined to crush her. When Alexander came to see her that night, he found her sitting at her kitchen table, the single overhead bulb flickering weakly. He had never looked so out of place, his tailored coat and polished shoes a stark contrast to the peeling paint and worn linoleum of her apartment. But he didn't comment on it. He simply sat across from her, his eyes meeting hers without judgment. "You don't have to go through this alone," he said quietly. Maya wiped her cheeks, her voice hoarse. "And what if I don't want to be your charity case?" His gaze softened, but his tone was firm. "You're not a charity case. You're the woman who saved my daughter's dignity when no one else would. You're the woman who taught her what bravery looks like. You're the woman who reminded me that integrity matters more than reputation. That's not charity, Maya. That's partnership." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and significant. Partnership, not savior and victim, not billionaire and waitress. Equal footing in a fight neither had chosen but both now faced. Maya looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any hint of condescension, any sign that this was about power or control. But she saw none. Only sincerity. Only resolve. Slowly she nodded. "All right, then we fight." From that night on, the battle became shared. Alexander leveraged his resources to hire the best legal team money could buy, determined to expose Karen's lies and dismantle Roland Pierce's smear campaign. Maya, though terrified of courtrooms and headlines, refused to shrink. She told her story with clarity and honesty, standing firm even when reporters shouted questions meant to break her spirit. The fire was unrelenting. Headlines screamed. Cameras followed. Critics mocked. Supporters rallied. Through it all, Maya and Alexander stood side by side, each drawing strength from the other. And though the world sought to tear them apart, the storm that was meant to destroy them forged instead something unshakable. A bond tempered in fire. They had both thought the diner was the beginning. But as the trial loomed and the stakes grew higher, they began to realize the truth. That moment had been only a spark. This fight for dignity, for truth, for each other, this was the real test of fire. Transformation. The courthouse smelled of old wood and tension. Reporters crowded the steps outside, their cameras flashing as if the fate of the world depended on capturing every angle of Maya Williams' face. Inside, the air buzzed with murmurs, every whisper carrying judgment or speculation. For Maya, walking through those double doors was like stepping onto a stage she never auditioned for. The lawsuit had ballooned into a spectacle, feeding tabloids and television anchors who spun narratives of villainy and virtue without bothering to ask what was true. Maya sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white against the wood. She wore the same navy dress she had worn to dinner at Alexander's home, the only garment she owned that felt remotely appropriate for such a setting. Across the aisle sat Karen Doyle, pristine in designer attire, her expression carefully crafted to portray the wounded mother. At her side were attorneys in suits worth more than Maya's yearly rent, their briefcases brimming with rehearsed accusations. When the judge entered, the room rose. Alexander sat behind Maya, his presence a quiet fortress of support. His legal team occupied the benches nearby, prepared to dismantle the flimsy case, but Maya knew the truth. This wasn't just about facts. It was about perception. It was about whether the world would believe a waitress's voice over the polished lies of wealth and entitlement. The opening statements felt surreal. Karen's attorneys painted a picture of Maya as a volatile employee, prone to aggression, who had intimidated and physically endangered a child. Every word was a dagger, slicing into the fragile fabric of her reputation. Maya's stomach twisted as she listened, her throat tightening with the urge to protest. But when her turn came, when her attorney rose to speak on her behalf, something shifted. The narrative became clearer, stronger, grounded in truth. Her attorney reminded the court of the evidence, the diner full of witnesses who had seen the glass fly, the medical records confirming Maya's injury, the testimony of those who had heard Karen's cruel words. Most powerful of all was the knowledge that Alexander Cole himself was willing to testify, not as a billionaire, but as a father who had watched his daughter mocked and defended in the same moment. When Alexander took the stand, the room stilled. His voice carried authority, but it was the vulnerability beneath it that silenced the whispers. He spoke not of boardrooms or wealth, but of Lila, of her struggles, of how it felt to watch his daughter shrink under the weight of cruelty. He described Maya's actions in the diner with a precision that left no room for doubt. She stood when no one else would, he said, his gaze steady on the jury. Not for gain, not for attention, simply because it was right. And in that moment she gave my daughter something no amount of money has ever been able to buy: dignity. The words resonated like a bell. Even the reporters who had come hungry for scandal seemed to pause, their pens hovering as if unsure how to capture what had just been laid bare. Maya's throat tightened, her eyes stinging with unshed tears as she watched him. He wasn't shielding her with his power. He was standing beside her with his truth. Karen, on the other hand, faltered under cross-examination. Her carefully curated image cracked when confronted with the diner's surveillance footage, a grainy but unmistakable recording that showed her hurling the glass at Maya. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. For the first time, the weight of truth tilted against her, and no amount of designer polish could disguise the venom etched into her actions. When the judge dismissed the case, declaring the lawsuit baseless and cautioning Karen's legal team against abusing the court for personal vendettas, the relief that flooded Maya was so profound she nearly collapsed. Reporters clamored for her statement as she exited the courthouse, but she offered none. Instead, she walked silently into the waiting car where Alexander and Lila were already seated. The ride back to the mansion was quiet at first. Lila held Maya's hand tightly as if afraid she might vanish. Alexander watched Maya in the dim glow of the city lights, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke. "You didn't just survive that," he said softly. "You transformed it. You showed them that courage isn't about wealth or power. It's about truth." Maya looked at him, exhaustion etched into her face but a new fire sparking in her eyes. Maybe. But truth alone doesn't win unless someone's willing to stand for it. She glanced down at Lila, who leaned against her arm, eyes drooping with sleep. And sometimes it's not about standing for yourself. It's about standing so someone else can learn they're worth standing for. In the weeks that followed, the transformation spread beyond the courtroom. News outlets, once eager to crucify her, began to shift their narrative. Opinion columns highlighted the courage of an ordinary woman who had stood against cruelty and endured the venom of the privileged. Social media, which had once mocked her, now carried hashtags praising her resilience. Strangers left notes of encouragement on her apartment door, and though she still faced whispers and stares, they no longer felt like chains around her neck. For Alexander, the transformation was equally profound. He began to see the hollowness of the world he had built, where wealth insulated him but never truly connected him. Maya's presence in his life forced him to confront truths he had long ignored, that his daughter needed more than protection, that she needed examples of courage and authenticity, and that he, despite his fortune, had lived behind walls that had kept him safe but also kept him small. One evening, as the three of them sat in the garden behind the mansion, watching the sun melt into the horizon, Alexander turned to Maya with a seriousness that caught her off guard. "I've spent my life believing strength came from control," he said, "from managing risk, from building walls, but you've shown me strength is something else entirely. It's the willingness to face the fire, knowing it can burn and doing it anyway. Maya listened quietly, her gaze on the fading light. Strength is only real if it changes something, if it leaves the world a little better than it found it. The silence that followed was not heavy but full, like the pause before music begins. In that moment, it became clear that the storm had not destroyed them. It had remade them. Maya was no longer just a waitress. Alexander was no longer just a billionaire. Together, they had become something greater than the sum of their worlds, an example of what happens when truth, courage, and compassion collide. But transformation is never the end. It is only the beginning of another journey. And as Maya glanced at Lila, who now laughed freely in the twilight without fear of judgment, she realized the most important transformation was not her own or Alexander's, but the one blossoming in the little girl who had learned. Through it all, that dignity was her birthright. Legacy of light. The months after the trial passed not in silence but in a gradual reweaving of life. For Maya, the first changes were small, almost imperceptible. Strangers no longer looked at her with suspicion when she walked down the street. Neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors now stopped her to offer encouragement, pressing her hand with warmth that felt startling after so much coldness. The diner eventually reopened its doors to her, but Maya never returned to Clarkson's as an employee. Not because she was unwelcome, far from it, but because her life had shifted irreversibly. She had become something larger than her old routines could contain. Opportunities arrived that she never imagined possible. Community groups asked her to speak about resilience and courage. Schools invited her to meet with students who had faced bullying and hardship, to remind them that they were not powerless. Nonprofit organizations reached out, eager for her to help them advocate for children with disabilities and their families. At first, Maya resisted. She had never been comfortable in the spotlight, never sought recognition. Yet she could not ignore the faces she saw in those rooms, faces that reflected her own younger self. The girl who had longed for someone, anyone, to stand up and say she mattered. If her voice could provide that for others, then she would not waste it. Alexander, too, was changed. His empire had survived the smear campaigns, though not without scars. Some investors had fled and competitors still whispered, but the man who emerged from the fire was not the same one who had entered. The Alexander who once measured strength by control now understood its true source: vulnerability, authenticity, and the willingness to use power not as a shield, but as a bridge. He began redirecting his fortune more boldly, funding initiatives that supported communities often overlooked, single mothers, underfunded schools, and programs that gave dignity to children with special needs rather than hiding them away. But the greatest transformation lay in Lila. Freed from the constant weight of pity and mockery, she blossomed. Her laughter became fuller, her confidence brighter. She began speaking in front of small groups, sharing her experiences not as a tragedy but as a triumph. Maya became not just a role model but a friend, someone who reminded her daily that her voice was worth hearing, no matter how halting or tremulous it might sound. In the presence of Maya's unwavering belief, Lila discovered her own. It wasn't long before the three of them, once strangers bound only by an incident in a diner, were seen together often, not as Billionaire and Waitress but as something closer to a family. The tabloids, ever hungry, still tried to spin stories, but the public had grown weary of scandal. What they saw instead was authenticity: a man, a woman, and a child, each changed by the courage to defy cruelty. The narrative had shifted from gossip to inspiration, and for once the world preferred the truth. One evening, nearly a year after the trial, Maya found herself standing on the stage of a modest auditorium in the city. The event had been organized by a coalition of local charities to celebrate stories of resilience. She had been reluctant to accept the invitation, fearing the weight of expectation, but Alexander had encouraged her, and Lila had begged her with wide eyes until she agreed. Now, as she looked out at the rows of faces, students, parents, workers, people from all walks of life, she felt her heart pound with the gravity of the moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady, carrying not just her words but the journey that had brought her here. She told them about the diner, about the silence she had refused to accept, about the storm that had tried to break her. She told them about dignity, about the cost of courage, about the truth that doing the right thing is rarely the easiest choice. And then she told them the most important part, that courage is not about being fearless, but about standing even when fear is loudest. As she finished, the room rose in applause, not the polite kind, but the kind that comes from people who feel themselves seen. Maya's eyes found Alexander's in the crowd, his expression steady with pride. Beside him, Lila clapped with the unrestrained joy of a child who knew without doubt that she mattered. That night, walking home beneath the quiet canopy of stars, Maya thought about the girl she used to be. The one who scrubbed dishes in silence, who bent beneath the weight of the world, who thought her life was destined for nothing more than survival. She wished she could whisper to that girl now, tell her that dignity was not something others could give or take. It was something she carried all along, waiting for the moment she would claim it. And she realized something else. The legacy of what had happened in the diner was not hers alone, nor Alexander's, nor even Lila's. It belonged to everyone who had witnessed it, everyone who had felt the stir of courage inside themselves and chosen to act. The ripples had become waves, and those waves would continue long after headlines faded. Maya smiled as the breeze tugged at her hair. She didn't know what the future would hold, whether her path and Alexander's would intertwine in ways deeper than partnership, whether the world would continue to test them, whether new storms would rise. But she knew this. Whatever came, they would face it not with silence, but with the kind of light that refuses to be dimmed. Because in the end, one act of defiance in a diner had become a beacon. And that beacon, carried by courage and love, would continue to shine long after the storm had passed. It was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a legacy of light